Most people come out here, they want to see movie stars and celebrities, right? Then people want to know where to go. Hollywood and Vine, you won't see anybody. That's true. Now, you can go to Schwab's drugstore on Sunset Boulevard, and you can see Orson Welles.
For 3 decades, Johnny Carson ruled American television from behind the desk of The Tonight Show. Every evening, millions tuned in not just to laugh at his razor-sharp monologues or Ed McMahon's booming introductions, but to watch Hollywood royalty drop their guard and chat with the man who felt like everyone's late-night friend. Carson was the great cultural filter. If you sat on his couch, you weren't just a star, you were an American institution. But what viewers never saw was the sharp contrast between Carson's public warmth and his private judgments. Off camera, he was far less forgiving. According to those who worked closest to him, Carson maintained a mental blacklist of celebrities he considered not just difficult or temperamental, but genuinely rotten people. He wasn't talking about stars who arrived late, flubbed a story, or had oversized egos. He meant people who, in his eyes, were cruel, manipulative, and even dangerous. In his later years, Carson became more candid about these experiences. To friends and confidants, he described the handful of Golden Age icons who had shocked him with their behavior, the ones he believed hid behind carefully crafted public images while spreading misery in private. These weren't tabloid rumors or secondhand stories. Carson had watched them up close, under the pressure of live television, and he had seen what few others dared admit. What he revealed was disturbing. A legendary actress who verbally assaulted a young staffer until she fled in tears. A beloved crooner who behaved more like a mob enforcer than a guest. And a comedian who Carson privately described as truly hateful. For Carson, these weren't simply bad nights or awkward encounters. They were glimpses into the darker side of Hollywood's so-called Golden Age. So who were these 7 guests that Carson believed were actually evil? Let's begin with the woman he once described as a beautiful statue with nothing inside. A Hollywood queen whose icy charm fooled millions, but never Johnny Carson. When Joan Crawford walked onto the Tonight Show stage in 1970, the audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Here was Hollywood royalty. Her immaculate posture, glittering gown, and perfectly rehearsed smile radiating old Hollywood glamour. For viewers at home, it was a treat. For Johnny Carson and his staff, it was a nightmare. Long before Crawford even arrived, her presence was already felt through a 4-page list of demands sent to the production office. The lighting had to be arranged at precise angles to flatter her cheekbones. The studio temperature had to remain locked at exactly 67 degrees, no higher, no lower. The height of Carson's desk and the angle of her chair were to be measured and adjusted. It read more like instructions for building a rocket ship, one technician later said. When she finally entered the studio, 3 hours before taping, she didn't trust the Tonight Show's award-winning makeup team. She brought her own artists, treating the in-house staff as though they were amateurs. Yet none of that compared to what happened when a young production assistant accidentally stepped into Crawford's dressing room with the water she had requested. According to multiple witnesses, Crawford exploded with such venom that staff in the hallway froze. She allegedly called the 20-year-old assistant a brainless little tramp and sneered that she should find work in a brothel where incompetence might be an asset. The young woman fled in tears, only for Crawford to demand she be fired on the spot. Carson's producer refused, and tension hung over the taping like a storm cloud. Then came Crawford's performance on stage. The moment the red light blinked on, the venomous diva transformed into Hollywood's gracious queen. Every answer, every laugh, every supposedly spontaneous anecdote had been rehearsed. But the instant the cameras cut to commercial, her face hardened into a stone mask, silent and unapproachable. She was like a machine pretending to be a woman, one producer recalled. Carson, a master at connecting with difficult personalities, found nothing to work with. Later, he quipped to Ed McMahon, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality." Years afterward, when Christina Crawford's memoir, Mommy Dearest, exposed the star's alleged abuse of her adopted children, Carson simply nodded. "I saw who she really was in those few hours," he reportedly said. "I believe every word." For Johnny Carson, Joan Crawford wasn't just difficult. She was chilling, an actress whose icy charm hid a darkness he couldn't ignore. But if Crawford embodied cold calculation, Carson's next evil guest represented something far more intimidating: raw power used like a weapon. Few names in American entertainment carried as much weight as Frank Sinatra. To audiences, he was Old Blue Eyes, the voice that could melt a room with a ballad or electrify it with a swing number. When Sinatra sat on Carson's couch, the air buzzed with history, stories of the Rat Pack, glamorous nights in Vegas, and tales of Hollywood excess. On screen, Carson played the respectful host. Off-screen, however, he privately despised the singer. It wasn't Sinatra's talent that bothered Carson. He respected that. What unnerved him was how Sinatra treated people when he thought no one of importance was watching. "If he didn't sing, he'd be a mob enforcer," Carson once confided to a friend. "And sometimes I think he was both." Sinatra rarely arrived alone. His entourage, 8 men, sometimes more, would stalk through the studio, their presence compared to an FBI raid. Crew members described the atmosphere as like being under surveillance. If Sinatra wanted something, assistants scrambled. If someone annoyed him, the tension spread instantly. One of Carson's most infamous memories came during the early 1970s. A veteran floor manager, whose job was to give the standard 3-minute warning before a segment, politely approached Sinatra. Instead of a nod, the singer grabbed him by the tie, yanking him close. "Nobody tells me when I've got 3 minutes," Sinatra snarled. "I go on when I'm ready." The man, a Korean War veteran in his 50s, was shaken. Watching from his office monitor, Carson nearly canceled the appearance. Only the promise of blockbuster ratings convinced him to continue. Sinatra's unreliability compounded the problem. He would cancel appearances with hours' notice, sometimes when he was already in the building. Once, during a commercial break, Sinatra insulted a female staff member's looks loud enough for half the crew to hear. Carson, usually the picture of professionalism, broke his silence. "We don't talk about my staff that way here." Sinatra was stunned. The cameras rolled again, and both men slipped back into character. Sinatra with his effortless charm, Carson with his smooth questions. But something had shifted. Carson's tone grew colder. His questions clipped. Afterward, he told his producer, "I don't care what his ratings are. Once a year, maximum." For Johnny Carson, a man who rarely interfered in booking decisions, this was extraordinary. It meant one of the most powerful entertainers in the world had crossed a line. In Carson's eyes, Sinatra wasn't just difficult. He was a charming bully, a man who wielded fame like a cudgel. And while Sinatra intimidated through raw force, Carson's next evil guest used something more insidious: sheer ego, so enormous it swallowed the show whole. When Orson Welles appeared on The Tonight Show, you could feel the air pressure change. The voice, the cape-like coats, the magician's hands punctuating a story. He didn't just sit on Carson's couch, he occupied it. Viewers at home got a master raconteur, a living museum exhibit of cinema history. Carson and his staff, however, braced for combat. The trouble usually started before Welles even saw a camera. According to writers who prepped Johnny's segments, Welles regularly dismissed their work outright. They would hand him a tidy page of topics and pivots, crafted to land laughs and give Carson a runway to steer. Welles would strike through it all with a pen, then pass it back like a graded exam, an empty page where questions used to be. Pedestrian, he'd say. Obvious. The message was clear. There would be no structure but his. Live television hates chaos. Welles thrived on it. If the rundown allotted 7 minutes, he took 25. If Carson flashed the agreed-upon wind-down signals, Welles treated them as cues to expand. He would launch into labyrinthine tales of Lisbon nights, broken princes, and Parisian dinners with painters who had no last names. Stories that dazzled until you looked at the clock and realized 3 segments had vanished. 2 other guests were bumped entirely one night, their publicists livid in the hallway while Welles, unbothered, sipped water like a conductor finishing a symphony. Crew members didn't fare better. Welles had a habit of speaking past people instead of to them. "Tell the girl I need more water." Ask the boy to move the light 2 degrees. He even tried to direct the show from his chair, chin raised toward the rafters. Camera 2 should come in tighter on Johnny now. It wasn't a joke. He meant it. Carson admired genius and despised entitlement. Watching Welles treat a shared stage like sovereign territory got under his skin. After a particularly unruly visit, Johnny confided to Ed McMahon, half amused and half exhausted, "Genius is not diplomatic immunity." Welles's brilliance was never in question. His courtesy was. On The Tonight Show, the camera was supposed to reveal a guest. With Welles, it revealed a gravitational field. Bette Davis didn't enter a room. She cross-examined it. On camera, she was a late-career jewel. Razor wit, steel spine, eyes that could roll an anecdote across the studio and drop it right in Carson's lap. She was funny, frank, and gloriously unfiltered. Off camera, the filter sometimes vanished altogether, and what remained could be blistering. The staff learned quickly, if Davis shared a couch with other guests, oxygen would be scarce. Let a younger actor find a rhythm, and Davis cut in like a prosecuting attorney. She didn't just interrupt, she redirected. A story about a new film became a referendum on craft. A harmless quip about costumes turned into a withering line on amateurs who confuse wardrobe with character. It made for mesmerizing television and frosty green rooms. Backstage could be rougher. Davis liked a stiff drink before airtime, a habit not unusual for the era, but it sometimes sharpened her edges. Makeup touches that took too long drew raps on the arm of the chair. Cue cards held a second too low earned a tart aside. Once, during a rehearsal snafu, she snapped at a young cardholder for being as slow as a matinee audience. The kid froze. That was when Carson stepped in, not with a speech, but with a quiet line that landed with finality. "Miss Davis, on this show we speak to everyone with respect, or we don't speak at all." It worked. For the rest of that taping, a truce was held. But the pattern repeated over the years. Electric television paired with backstage casualties. Carson could handle temper, and he could certainly handle star power. What he couldn't abide was contempt for people doing their jobs. He loved Davis the legend. He disliked Davis the steamroller. After her final visit, he reportedly told a producer, equally regretful and relieved, "No one should need a lawyer to sit on that couch." For Carson, the verdict wasn't that Bette Davis was talentless or cruel for sport. It was simpler and, in a way, sadder. The same ferocity that made her great on screen sometimes scorched the people closest to the flame. Mickey Rooney arrived with history in his pocket. He'd been a star before television was furniture, a comet who'd shared marquees with Judy Garland and outgrossed entire studios. Book him on The Tonight Show, and you booked a century's worth of Hollywood oxygen. That was the promise, anyway. The reality, in later years, grew messier. Rooney's segments could be chaotic from the first handshake. He talked fast, laughed louder, and pinballed through stories until setups and punchlines were waving at each other from opposite corners of the set. On a good night, the anarchy was charming. On a bad one, it was booze-slicked and uncomfortable. Crew members recall at least a few appearances where his words slurred and anecdotes veered into places late-night comedy couldn't safely follow. Mid-story pivots, "No, wait, let me tell you about Judy," left Carson with the unenviable task of threading live needles while the clock screamed. Worse were the moments that didn't air. Young women on staff dreaded being assigned to Rooney's dressing room. What he might have once considered gallant now landed as invasive. Hands that lingered, compliments that weren't, questions that came too close. "He'd hold your wrist when you passed him the water," one former assistant recalled. "Not hard, just too long." Carson heard the complaints. He believed them. And he hated that the responsibility to fix it sat with him and a show designed for laughter. One night, an up-and-coming actress shared the couch. Rooney's remarks drifted from playful to plainly inappropriate. Carson cut to commercial early, leaned over during the break, and changed the energy with a single neutral question the audience would never remember. After the taping, he found the actress in the hallway and apologized. "That's not how professionals behave on this show," he said. He meant it, and he acted on it. Rooney's bookings tightened. Daytime pre-tapes replaced live segments. Guardrails went up. Carson could forgive age, nerves, even a little chaos. Television is built on all three. What he couldn't excuse was making the weakest person in the room carry the discomfort. Rooney's legacy as a prodigy survived. His welcome on Carson's stage did not. On camera, Zsa Zsa was pure late-night sparkle. Flirtatious, funny, and unmissable. Off-camera, she could stop a production cold. Her writer became lore, orchids only, a dressing room set to exactly 74 degrees, Perrier with 3 ice cubes, her own lighting tech, and, reportedly, no female guests under 40 on the same show. If anything was off, the countdown stalled. One taping nearly derailed over a missing makeup brand until Johnny himself called to coax her to set. Carson loved precision. Zsa Zsa loved control. Crews waited, schedules bent, and other guests cooled in hallways while she calibrated glamour to the millimeter. After one such night, Johnny quipped privately, "I'd rather interview a cat." And yet, when that red light blinked, she delivered ratings gold. For Carson, she was the industry's bargain in a single person. Dazzling television at a price the people behind the curtain paid. Jerry Lewis arrived as a legend, comic innovator, telethon saint, then burned goodwill in minutes. On air, he hijacked conversations and once tugged Johnny's tie as a gag. To Carson, that crossed a boundary. Backstage, accounts say he belittled crew, refused to learn names, and exploded when a cameraman coughed during rehearsal, demanding the man be removed. What offended Johnny most was the dissonance. Televised tears for charity, private contempt for people with no power. After a particularly sour visit in the early 80s, Carson drew a quiet line: no more bookings. In a town crowded with egos, Johnny's verdict was unusually sharp. Lewis wasn't just difficult, he was, in Carson's private words, truly hateful. Johnny Carson wasn't quick to judge, nor was he eager to make enemies. For 30 years, his job was to make every guest look good, even the nervous, the eccentric, or the arrogant. He tolerated plenty, lateness, ego, even a little drunkenness. But there was one line he refused to cross: cruelty. When Joan Crawford verbally shredded a young assistant, Carson never forgot it. When Frank Sinatra bullied staff with mob-like menace, Carson quietly limited his visits. When Orson Welles hijacked the show with an unchecked ego, Carson rolled his eyes but took note. Bette Davis's scathing contempt, Mickey Rooney's invasive behavior, Zsa Zsa Gabor's endless demands, and Jerry Lewis's cruelty all revealed the same thing to Carson. Hollywood's brightest stars could be its darkest people. Carson's judgments matter because he had nothing to gain by making them. He was at the top of his profession, secure, powerful. His assessments came not from bitterness, but from observation. How do they treat the people who can do nothing for them? That was his test, recalled one longtime producer. And by that test, many idols failed. In the years since Carson's death in 2005, his private blacklist looks less like gossip and more like foresight. Christina Crawford's memoir exposed Joan. Sinatra's connections to organized crime became public. Reports of Mickey Rooney's behavior surfaced. Jerry Lewis's cruelty was confirmed by colleagues. Time, in many cases, proved Carson right. We remember Hollywood's golden age as glamorous, filled with larger-than-life icons who embodied charm and sophistication. Carson's secret stories remind us it was also an age of silence, when cruelty could hide behind sequins, smiles, and applause. Unlike today, when one viral clip can end a career, the old studio system buried the truth. Perhaps Carson put it best in one of his rare, candid moments. The camera doesn't just add 10 pounds, it adds a layer of fiction. His genius wasn't just in making people laugh, it was in seeing through that fiction. And when he did, he found that some of the Golden Age's brightest stars carried shadows darker than anyone watching at home could imagine.